So tonight I want to share with you an amazing idea that kind of explains for us some of the arrangement of the Haggadah, particularly the section of Magid, the section where we tell over the story and more, as we'll see. Also, in doing so, we'll kind of get a brief overview of the various paragraphs in Magid. Not every single one. We're not going to read through everything, but it will be a good refresher to get us thinking about Pesach, and we'll learn a tremendous insight into how Magid was arranged. So what I will do is I will share my screen. You can also have a Haggadah in front of you if you want, but I'll have it up here. That has the Magid section. This class is basically based off of a essay, I guess we could call it, in the introduction to what's called the Medrash Haggadah or the Malbim Haggadah. We've mentioned the Malbim in the past, one of the great commentators from the 19th century. This Haggadah actually, it's not so clear actually if it was written by the Malbim. People call it the Malbim Haggadah, but that may have been an error. It seems it was more likely written by one of his students, Rabbi Naftali Maskil La'eson, his name.
Okay, do you want to go on this Zoom?
All right, okay, there we go. Okay, and that is more likely. So it's his idea, it seems, and it explains for us the order of the Haggadah. So what we're going to do is look through some of the paragraphs of Magid, pose a series of questions, and then we will try to explain the order as we'll see. So if you have an unrelated question, I'll just ask you to wait till the end if that's okay. Okay, so let's start basically from the beginning. So this line over here, V'yigadata levincha, you should speak to your son on that day, saying, for the sake of this, did the Lord do this for me in going out of Egypt? So this is not part of the Haggadah, although it's mentioned a couple times in the Haggadah. This is the verse that teaches us that we are to tell over the story of the Exodus on the night of Pesach, and the Haggadah actually brings this in a number of contexts. So we'll see that as we go. But I wanted to just put that up, and we'll see. We're going to come back to this verse as the class progresses. So the Magid begins where we invite others to our Seder, and but where it really begins is with the Manishtana. Probably the most famous part of the Haggadah, where we pose the question, why is this night different from all other nights? And actually in the commentary of the Malbim Haggadah, he explains that we start with this because this really, we know the questions, right? These are not, and we're to ask the questions even if we're sitting by ourselves. The purpose of this section, he says, is to create contrasts for ourselves right from the outset. He says, if you would read through the Haggadah, so we start with telling over the story, we start from slavery and we get to freedom, but it's a development. We don't see necessarily the shocking difference between bitter slavery and freedom. It's you tell over the steps, and when it's gradual, so it's less alarming and less intense, and perhaps in our eyes could be less significant. When we start by comparing the matzah, which is the bread of freedom, and the maror, the matzah is the bread of affliction, and the maror, which is the bitter herbs, and we start with that, and then we say, but also we're dipping tonight, and we're reclining tonight, and we're showing expressions of freedom. So we create this contrast right from the outset, which tells us that we were taken from bigger herbs, bigger slavery, to reclining to freedom. And that can help us appreciate the redemption even more. And so that's how we want to start off the night, by just knowing, keeping in mind this tremendous transformation that occurred for us. Then we basically begin Magid, really. And it really begins with the section of Avadim Hayinu. We were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Now, it seems like we're telling the story here. We were slaves to Pharaoh in the land of Egypt. We've begun to tell the story of the Haggadah. We were slaves to Pharaoh in the land of Egypt, and the Lord our God took us out from there with a strong hand and an outstretched forearm. So it seems we're starting the story. But then, all of a sudden, we digress, and we say, and if the Holy One, blessed be, and not taking our ancestors from Egypt, we and our children and our children's children will all be enslaved to Pharaoh in Egypt. And even if we were all sages, all discerning, all elders, all knowledgeable about the Torah, it would be a commandment upon us to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. So a few questions. First of all, why are we starting to tell the story and then interrupting? And then all of a sudden we're saying, if we had not been taken out, we would still be there. And by the way, everybody has an obligation, even if you know the story, even if you're knowledgeable, it's a commandment to tell the story. So that's going to be our, what we call that question number one, relating to Avadim Hayinu. Why do we start to tell the story? Why do we stop? And maybe to add to the question, when we do finally get back to the story, because actually we'll come back to these paragraphs, but we interrupt with a whole bunch of paragraphs that aren't really telling the story of the Exodus. And then finally, a little while later, we get to this paragraph where we say, from the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers, and we then tell the story how we got down to Egypt, and et cetera, et cetera. And we really begin to actually tell about what happened. So why don't we start with that? If we're going to eventually go back and say, even before we got to Egypt, Abraham, his ancestors were idol worshippers. So why don't we start with that? Why are we starting with we were slaves in Egypt and then going back to, from the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers? So what's with the order here? And what are we really adding, going back up to the paragraph of Avadim Hayinu, if we were slaves, what is being added to the story? We're going to say all this later. We were slaves and God took us out. So what is even the point? What is the purpose of this paragraph? Furthermore, in this paragraph, we say that even if we were all sages, all elders, it would be a commandment upon us to tell the story. Why? If we know the story, then why is it necessary for us to tell it, to continue to tell it? Fine. So that's our questions about the Avadim Hayinu section. So we're going to have a lot of questions, and then we're going to come back and answer them. Then we move on to the next paragraph. The next paragraph tells us the story of some great sages who were having their Seder together in Israel. So it was Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yoshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon. So this is, going back to, I don't know, maybe the year 200 or so, or even, probably around then. So maybe a little earlier than that. So we have our great sages, and we have a story here that they were telling the story of the Exodus, and it went the whole night, and then their students came and woke them up. Okay, a beautiful story. What's that doing here? What is this trying to show us? Furthermore, we then go on, and we have another paragraph. It's a statement of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah says, I'm 70 years old, or I'm like 70 years old. And he basically explains to us that he used to think that it was an obligation every night to talk about the Exodus. And then he learned that it's not just every night, it's every day. So, and that is the halacha that's codified. We're supposed to mention the Exodus, not just the night of Pesach, the night of Passover, but actually every morning and every night, every day and every night. Now, does that have anything to do with Pesach, with Passover? I mean, they're both about the Exodus, but that's not what we're doing on the Pesach night. On the Pesach night, there's much more than that. We're to tell over the story, reenact it, relive it. The daily obligation is that we're supposed to mention it. We're supposed to mention the Exodus in the daytime. We're supposed to mention it at nighttime. So what is this paragraph even doing in the Haggadah? It's nothing to do with Pesach. It's telling us that every day in the morning and the night, there is an obligation to mention the Exodus. It doesn't seem to belong at the Seder because it has nothing to do with the Seder. So what is this doing here? Then we continue. And we have the section about the 4 sons. So I think important just to understand what this section is. So there are 3 times in the Torah where in different sections, some are in Exodus, in Parshas Bo, in Shemos, some are in Devarim, in Parshas Vaschan and Deuteronomy, that someone poses a question related to the Exodus, and then the Torah tells us how to answer. And then there's a 4th time where it just tells us, tell your child. It doesn't even, there's no question posed. So the sages, the authors of the Haggadah, interpret these 4 occurrences. 3 times it has somebody pose a question and then tells us how to answer. And 1 time it just says, teach your child. Now this is referring to 4 different types of children who either there's the wise son, there's the wicked son, there's the son who doesn't really know how to ask, and there's the simple son who asks, but asks a simple question, and there's the son who doesn't even know how to ask. And those 4 sections are referring to 4 types of children. And there's a lot to say about that, a lot of, how we interpret the verses to refer to these different children, what it means for us. Okay, that's not our topic tonight, but just important to understand what this section is doing. But we're going to try to explain what it's doing here. Why does the Haggadah stick it in right over here and by the way, there are 4 sons who ask 4 different kinds of questions, or 3 that ask questions and 1 that doesn't. Why do we put that in the Haggadah right over here? Then we go on, and after we read about the 4 sons, we read the following teaching that says that I might have thought that we should discuss the Exodus on the Rosh Chodesh, on the 1st of Nisan. However, the Torah tells us that you do it by Yomahu, on that day. Sorry, I might have thought that you should do it already from Rosh Chodesh, but the Torah says, actually going back to that verse that we started with, which we had on the top, it said, the Gadata Levincha, actually it's repeated right over here. So we have it over here. Well, I'm reading this paragraph, but we have the verse right here. So it says, you might think that that the commandment of the Higadata Levincha, of teaching our children the story of the Exodus, is on the day of Rosh Chodesh, when the beginning of Nisan. That's why it says, Bayomahu, on that day. Speak to your son on that day. So, which in the context we can understand is referring to the 15th of Nisan. Now it says, you might think that you do it during the daytime, meaning on that day of the Karban Pesach. That's really what it's saying. On the day that the Pesach offering is brought, that's when you do it. Now you might think you should do it in the daytime, because actually the Pesach offering is brought the eve of Pesach, the day, what we call Erev Pesach, when we're preparing for the Seder. That's when the Pesach offering was brought. You think our Erev Pesach is busy, right? Back in the day, they were also bringing the the Pesach offering that day. It was even more busy. So you might think that that the commandment to tell over the story is during that time when you're bringing the Pesach offering. That's why it says ba'avur zeh, because of this, for the sake of this, meaning to teach me that for the sake of this, that it's to be observed that the commandment to tell over the story is when matzah and maror are resting in front of you. So that's how we arrive at this conclusion that the time, because the commandment to have matzah and maror is only in the evening. That's clear from the verse. It's the evening of the 15th. So from the fact that it says, for the sake of this, we understand that the time to actually tell over, v'higada levinchan, you will speak to your child, is actually on the evening of Pesach, at the time that we are also have the matzah and maror at the ready. So what we want to ask over here is, why is this here? Why is this stuck in right over here? We just finished with the 4 sons, and then we're going to what we actually had scrolled down to before. We're going to start telling over the story that from the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers. Why is the establishment of when the commandment is placed right over here? It could have been anywhere else. What is the significance? Why did the sages who arranged the Haggadah decide to put it right over here? Okay, then we begin to tell the story, and we read about how our ancestors were idol worshippers. Fine. God keeps his promise. He always keeps his promise in every generation. Then we're not going to read through the whole thing. This is like paragraph after paragraph describing what occurred to us in Egypt, how we descended down to Egypt, and what it was like for us then, etc. This is really where we're telling over the story. We do it based on verses actually from Deuteronomy, when a person would bring the first fruits, the Bikurim, there was something they were supposed to say, which was expressing thanks to God for what brought them to that moment. And part of that expression of appreciation was not just what brought them here in their immediate lifetime, but also how'd they get here, where do we come from? So they would tell over the whole story of the Exodus and thank God for that. So that's where we draw from and we tell over the story. Fine. After that, we mentioned, that's part of the story. We mentioned the 10 plagues. It's part of the story. Fine. Keep going. We thank God for it. We have the Dayenu, which we thank God for that and many other things. And then we come to this very important paragraph. It's very important because it expresses for itself why it's very important. Rabbi Gamliel was accustomed to say, anyone who has not said these 3 things on Pesach has not fulfilled his obligation. Rabbi Gamliel would say, if you don't say and you don't explain, you don't talk about these 3 things, you don't fulfill your obligation of the Passover Seder, of the telling over the story. And that is, you have to mention the Pesach sacrifice, you have to mention the matzah, and you have to mention the maror. So first question is, why is this here? Again, we're talking about the arrangement, the Seder. The word Seder actually means order. The Seder of the Seder, the order of the Seder. Why is this paragraph right here? Meaning we just finished telling over the whole story, thanking God for all the miracles, right, with Dayenu. And now we're saying if you don't mention these 3 things, then you have not fulfilled your obligation. What's it doing here? What do we say right after? So first we say, we talk about the Pesach offering. Then we say, this matzah, what's it for? It's the matzah. Again, we're identifying the matzah. We have to identify 3 things. We don't identify the Pesach offering because we don't have it. But we identify the matzah. We say, matzah zo, this matzah. What's it for? It's because the bread, they didn't have time for the bread to rise as they left Egypt. Okay, then we pick up the maror, we point to the maror, and we say, maror, this maror, what's it for? And we explain it's because the Egyptians made us bitter. And then we talk about telling every generation we have to see ourselves as if we left Egypt. So this little important part that Rabbi Gamliel throws in, that you have to mention these three things. Why is it here? Why is it placed in between, like basically Dayenu and where we're saying every generation a person has to see themselves as if they left Egypt? Why is that the place that's chosen for that teaching? Where would have been a better place? So maybe just in the terms of the flow of things, seemingly, if we go back to the paragraph that read, excuse me, find it. There, that one. The one that we just read before, Yachol me Rosh Chodesh, that I would have thought that it's from Rosh Chodesh, the mitzvah, the commandment to tell over the story. I would have thought it's Rosh Chodesh. We're saying, no, it's the Naiga Pesach. When? It's when the matzah and mar are resting in front of you. Isn't that the perfect time now to jump in and saying, Rabbi Gamliel says that if you don't mention the matzah and mar and the carbon Pesach, you don't fulfill your obligation. Shouldn't it be right there? Isn't that a better place to put that paragraph? Why is it that we first have this whole thing, page after page, of telling over the story, and then we finally have Rabbi Gamliel come in and say, and if you don't say these three things, you didn't fulfill your obligation. Seemingly, up there would have been a much more logical place for Rabbi Gamliel's teaching, that you have to mention the Pesach carbon, the Pesach offering, the matzah, and the mar. Furthermore, how does Rabbi Gamliel know this? He doesn't source this. He just says, if you don't say these three things, you don't fulfill your obligation. Where did he get that from? Where does that come from? Now, after this, we proceed. Question. We have a hand raised. Go ahead. You have to unmute. Do you want to unmute? Is that a real hand? There you go. Go ahead. I can't hear you, so maybe you don't have sound. Okay, we'll wait. If you get a microphone on, then we could try again. Okay, so the Haggadah proceeds, and after we mention that you have to mention these three things, then we saying every generation a person has to see themselves as if they left Egypt. And then we proceed to Hallel, to praise God and thank God. We don't do the entire Hallel at this point. Part of Hallel is said at the end of the Seder, but we have like two paragraphs basically from the Hallel, these praises of God for miracles that he has wrought for us. And we mentioned two paragraphs here, thanking God for his salvation. So why is that here? Why is Hallel placed at this point? Why is it right after this idea of in every generation, a person has to see themselves as if they left Egypt? And then we go on to Hallel. Okay, so I hope that I've asked enough questions. And if you don't remember them all, it's okay, because as we answer them, we will also reintroduce them. So what we'll do at this point is we'll go all the way back up to the top, and we'll start to go through again and try to answer the questions. So the questions begin in the paragraph of Avadim Hayinu, we were slaves to Paro in Egypt. Now, actually, maybe even before we start, we discuss that. We mentioned at the beginning the verse, and you shall speak to your son or to your children, saying, your child, that on that day, saying, for the sake of this did the Lord do this for me going out of Egypt. And this is what we're to tell our children. We're supposed to tell over what occurred for us in Egypt, tell over the story of the Exodus. And this is the primary source for the commandment of telling over the story. Now, not only that, but it actually, to really understand this, let's actually go down a little bit. Sorry, all the scrolling, but we have to get everything in context. So as I mentioned, there's 4 sons. There's the wise son. He asks a question. What are these testimonies, statutes, and judgments? There's the wicked son. He says, what is this worship to you? There's the simple son. He says, what is this? Now, as I mentioned, those are all verses in the Torah, and the sages are applying them to different personalities, let's say. And then we have the she'eno yodea lishol, the one who doesn't know how to ask. And it says, you have to open up for him. You have to get the conversation going, because he didn't even ask a question. And that's where it quotes this verse, and you shall tell your children on that day and explain to them about the Exodus. And what we see from that is that even if they don't ask, we're still to tell them. That is the commandment, to tell over the story. So now that we have established that that verse is the source for the commandment for the Seder night, so now the author of the Malbim Haggadah uncovers for us something amazing. It's one of these things that, you see the tremendous wisdom of the compilers of the Haggadah. You see that they're very calculated and careful. We have what seems to be just a jumble of paragraphs, right? Paragraph after paragraph. Is there any order to this? Why does it jump from here to there, back to this? So sometimes also you have like an explanation that somebody introduces, and it just rings 100% true. We're left with little doubt that they've nailed it, and they've discovered something that's hidden there, but as we'll see, in a certain way, hidden in plain sight. Just the most amazing thing. So says the Malbim Haggadah that being that this is the source for the commandment to tell over the story of the Exodus, this is also the map for the section of Magid. This verse is the map of how those who arranged the Haggadah decided to order Magid. And there are 6 sections. The first section is V'higadata levincha, and you should speak to your son. The second section is Bayom hahu, on that day. The third section is Lemar, saying. The fourth section is Ba'avur zeh, for the sake of this. The fifth section is Asa Hashem li, did the Lord do this for me? And the last section is, the sixth is B'tzeisi min Mitzrayim, in my going out of Egypt. These are the 6 sections of Magid. This is the map for Magid. This is the order that the author of the Haggadah decided to follow. He decided to map out Magid based on the verse, which commands us to tell over the story of the Exodus. And we'll see it's also a logical progression to go in this order. It's not just a random map. It is a logical progression. So the first section is V'higadata levincha. That's the command. You should tell over to your child, and that's how we begin. So we begin with the paragraph of Avadim Hayinu. We were slaves to Pharaoh in the land of Egypt. So we read, we were slaves to Pharaoh in the land of Egypt. The Lord our God took us out from there. We seem to be telling the story already. But actually, we're not telling the story. What we are doing at this point is explaining. We are explaining where the commandment comes from. Why is it that we have a commandment of the V'higadata levincha? You should tell your children. The the reason that we are going to embark on this journey, the reason why we are going to embark on this exercise to tell over the story is because we were slaves to Pharaoh in the land of Egypt. And the Lord, our God, took us out from there with a strong hand and outstretched forearm. And had he not taken out our ancestors, we would still be there. This is relevant to us in this time. My children, right? Why am I telling you all this? Because this is relevant to us. This is something that affects us all. Had we not been taken out, we would be or could still have been slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. And we go on and we elaborate on who is this obligation upon. And we say that it's, even if we were all sages, all discerning, all elders, all knowledgeable about the Torah, it will be a commandment upon all of us to tell the story of the Exodus from Egypt. And what we're saying is that everybody has to do it. As soon as somebody says, oh, well, it doesn't apply to me, I don't need this. So then one person does that, the next person does that, and then we're no longer telling over the story to our children. So everybody has to do it. Everybody has to do it, even if you know the story so well. I mean, first of all, you can always learn it better. You always can discover new insights. But even besides for that, this is a communal activity. This is a shared activity, a shared experience. We're all doing it together because this is how we perpetuate our tradition and these fundamentals and foundations of our faith. And so everybody should do it. And that's how we start off. We start off, again, we're in the first part of the verse, you should tell your child, and we are explaining why we have to do this. Why? Because we were slaves in Egypt. And not only that, but everybody has to do it. Who does it apply to? It applies to everybody. Everybody has to get involved. Everybody has to be part of it. Once one person tries not to be involved, then the whole thing could disappear. And look, we go on and we say, you want to see an example of this? That's the next paragraph. It happened once that Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Tarfon, they were telling the story of the Exodus the whole night. These great sages, you think they didn't know the story? Oh, they knew it. They knew it backwards and forwards. But still, the Haggadah is bringing out for us that is highlighting that everybody has to do it. This is something that is an obligation upon everybody. Now, why at this point do we mention Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah's teaching? Rabbi Eliezer ben Azariah taught us, he was the one who said, I used to think you only have to tell over the story or mention, not even tell over the story. You only have to mention the Exodus every night of the year. And then I learned that you actually have to mention it every day as well. So you have to mention it every night and every day of the year. So we asked, that's very nice. It's a very nice idea, but what does it have to do with Pesach? What does it have to do with the Seder? That's not what we're doing at the Seder. At the Seder, we're reenacting, we're reliving, we're telling over the whole story. We're not just mentioning it. So why is it relevant that we're supposed to mention the Exodus both day and night? And the answer is that we are trying to highlight the difference. We're trying to highlight that this is actually different than that. Don't think that this is the same thing as what we have to do every other night of the year and every other day. It's true. There's an obligation every day and every night to mention the Exodus, but the obligation of the Seder is different. Other nights, you just have to mention it to yourself. On the Seder night, it's vihigadata, and you should tell it. You're supposed to be telling it over to others. Now, sometimes there aren't others there, so you'll tell it over to yourself. And that's, again, this perpetuation that everybody has to be doing it. But the essence of it is carrying on the tradition, telling it over to the next generation. That's the essence of it. So there's the Haggadah is actually trying to highlight that what we are doing on the Seder is actually different than what he was talking about. He was talking about just mentioning it in every day. And that's all it takes. You have to just say, God took us out from Egypt. You say that in the morning, you say it in the evening, and that's it. But at the Seder, that's not it. There's much more to it. And that's what's being highlighted in that. The Seder, it's not just to mention it to ourselves, it's to tell it over to others, to the next generation. And then we proceed and we talk about the 4 sons. And remember, it's vihigadata levincha. You should tell your son or tell your child. And there are different types of children, different personalities, and it doesn't really matter what their personality is. We have a commandment that we are supposed to be telling it over to them. And that's what this section is coming to bring out, is different types of children. And that's the vihigadata levincha. On our map of the section of Magid, we have, and you should tell over. Why should we tell it over? Because we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt and God took us out. Everybody has to do this. It's a communal thing. Everybody, even if you know it backwards and forwards, you have to do it. And it's to your children. That it's part of the way that we pass on the tradition, pass on the foundations of our faith, is through the telling over of the Exodus on the night of the Seder. So that's section number 1. Now, we'll come back to page 3. Let's just go back to our verse. So then it says, and you should tell your child, when? Bayomahu, on that day. So that's the second section, on that day. So now it makes a lot of sense what the next paragraph of the Haggadah is going to be. The next paragraph of the Haggadah says, you might think that you're supposed to tell the Exodus over at Rosh Chodesh, the 1st of Nisan. No, it says on that day. We end up saying it's that night, the night of Pesach. That's when you do it. So this section, this paragraph, is telling us when we have the commandment to tell over the story of the Exodus. Bayom hahu, on that day. So that's in the perfect spot. Actually, we have the verse right here again. And that's the first section. Bayom hahu, on that day. So the next section of the Haggadah is the on that day section. We established we have the commandment. Everybody has the commandment. And the next step is, when do we have that commandment? On that day, but really we learn out it's that night, the night of Pesach. That's when we have the commandment. Okay. Now we're ready for the third section. What's the third section? We don't have to go all the way back because it's right over here. And you should tell your child, that's the first section, Bayomahu, on that day. That's the second section. Lamor, saying. The third section is saying, is speaking out everything, speaking out the story. The third section is going to be the actual saying of the story of the Exodus. And that's in fact what it is. We start all the way back to the beginning. Now we're ready to tell the story. Avadim hayino, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. Why did we start with that? We weren't telling the story there. There we were just introducing the reason for the obligation. Now we're telling the story. From the beginning, our ancestors were idol worshippers. We ended up down in Egypt, etc. This is going to be the story. God kept his promise. He took us out. And we go through the whole history, which we're not going to go through now. But now we understand that the actual story, that's the lamor, that's the saying, what we're supposed to say to fulfill the commandment of telling over the story of the Exodus. Finally, after we tell over the whole story, we tell over all the different aspects of it, the 10 plagues, and then finally, we get to Dayenu, which is introduced with the words, Kama ma'alos tovos lamakom aleinu, how many degrees of good did God place upon us? And then we say all these acts of benevolence, all these things that God did for us. And this is placed after we've recounted the story. So we actually add a whole bunch of other things. We recounted the story, but there's much more. There's post-Exodus, which is also part of it. And that's all added in here. It's the extension of the story. So in a way, this actually extends the story. So we have God took us out and he judged the Egyptians, he judged their gods, and he made us rich. He split the sea for us. He took care of us in the desert, etc. He gave us the Torah. So this is all the what follows and is really sort of the postscript of the story, but is adding on to the story. And it's also an expression of our appreciation to God. So this is the third section. This is the lay more section. And then we come to Rabban Gamliel. So Rabban Gamliel told us that there are 3 things that you have to mention at the Seder. And that is, you have to mention the Pesach offering, you have to mention the matzah, and you have to mention the maror. And we asked, first of all, what is this doing here? Why is this placed right over here? It would have been much more logical to place it back when we said, when do you recite Yachol Me Rosh Chodesh? You might think that you should recite it the first of Nisan, and we end up saying that we tell over the story when the matzah and maror are sitting in front of us. So isn't that the best time to then mention? And by the way, you have to mention the matzah and the maror at the Seder. That would have been the perfect spot. But we don't do that. We wait until over here to bring Rabban Gamliel in. We also asked, where does he get this from? How does he know that we have to mention these things? So the answer is that this is section number 4. Go back to our verse. So, and you should tell your son, that's section number 1. Vayomahu, on that day, that's section number 2. Lay more, saying, telling over the story, that's section number 3. Ba'avur zeh, for the sake of this, that's section number 4. For the sake of this. So now it makes a lot of sense. For the sake of what? For the sake of, so there's different ways to read it, actually. Some actually say that God took us out for the sake of giving us these commandments. For the sake of the commandments, to give us the commandments of Pesach, Matzah, and Maror, that's why God took us out. The Malbim Haggadah actually suggests that Rabban Gamliel read it not as for the sake of this, but the opposite, that it was this, how does he read it? This is because of, that you are supposed to say on that day, this is because of, meaning what's this? And you should tell your child on that day, saying, and then you say, this is because of. What is this because of? This is for the sake of. This, meaning the Pesach offering, is because of X, the explanation of the Pesach offering, which we go on to explain over here. What was the, right? This is what it is. The Pesach offering, the Pesach sacrifice that our ancestors were accustomed to eating when the temple existed. For the sake of what was it? For the sake of what was it? The answer is because God passed over the homes, etc. Then we say, and the matzah, for the sake of what is it? And we answer because the dough didn't have time to rise. The maror, for the sake of what is it? For the sake of what is it? Oh, it's because we had, our lives were bitter. So this is the section number 4. Ba'avur zeh. Just say it right. This is because of. That's how he's reading it. This is because of. You should tell your child on that day. Tell your child, section number 1, on that day. Section number 2, saying, telling over the story. And then, ba'avur zeh. This is because of. What's this? Each of these things. So you have to explain, says Rabban Gamliel, what each of these things are for. Now, we don't have a Pesach offering, so we don't actually point or lift up our Pesach offering, but when they did, they could have. But we still explain what the Pesach offering was for. And then we go on and we say, we pick up the matzah and we say, this is because of, or we ask, what is this because of? And we explain, it's because their dough didn't have time to rise. And we get the maror and we say, this is because of. That's exactly what the verse is telling us to do. That's how Rabban Gamliel read it, at least. And that's where he got it from. Where did he get this idea that we have to explain? We have to mention these three things and explain them, because it says in the verse, this is because of, and this is each of those things. And that is why it's placed in the Haggadah right here, because this is section number 4, because we're following the map of the verse that commands us to tell over the story. Okay, now at that point, we move on and we read the paragraph that says that in each and every generation, a person is obligated to see himself as if he left Egypt. As it is stated, same verse, we keep coming back to the same verse, and you shall explain to your son on that day, tell your son on that day, for the sake of this, did the Lord do this for me in my going out of Egypt. Not only our ancestors did the Holy One, blessed be he, redeem, but rather also us, together with them did he redeem. As it is stated, he took us out from there in order to bring us in, to give us the land in which he swore unto our fathers. So this is section number 5, because the next part of the verse says, and this is exactly what this section is interpreting. It's like black on white, you know, this discovery, but it's an amazing discovery. Just follow the map. For the sake of this, what are we interpreting? We're interpreting that section of the verse right now. God did this for me. The Lord, for the sake of this, did the Lord do this for me in my going out of Egypt? It actually focuses, at least here, they italicize the my. We're focusing actually more on for me. He did this for me. This is the next section. The next section is Asa Hashem li. God did this for me. That a person has to view themselves as if God took them out from Egypt. Yeah, actually, I really would rather italicize not that. That's really not what it's focusing on. It's focusing on, did this for me. That because of this, Ba'avor zeh asa Hashem li. God did this for me. That in each generation, you have to view yourself as if God did this for you. That's what this is teaching us. And that's actually essential to fulfilling the commandment of telling over the story of the Exodus. It's not just telling it over. It's actually reliving it, reenacting it, trying to create the feeling within ourselves that we ourselves were taken out of Egypt. And that is expressed here in section number 5 of the Haggadah. And then, or Magid. And then we come to the final section. And the last words, since we have the verse here so conveniently, the last words are, B'tseisi mi Mitzrayim, when I went out from Egypt, or in my going out of Egypt. So this brings us to Hallel, to thanking God. Now, we read in Hallel, therefore, we are obligated to thank, praise, glorify, etc. Right after we've read everything that we've said up till now, we've told the story, we say, therefore, we have to thank God. And we have to, we mention all that he did, all the miracles. He brought us out from slavery to freedom, from sorrow to joy. Let us say a new song before him, Hallelujah. And then we recite 2 paragraphs from Hallel. The first paragraph is the first paragraph of Hallel. The Hallel that we would say, you know, on holidays as part of the davening. But I think it's really trying to get to the second paragraph. We start from the first paragraph to go in order, but I think we're trying to really get to the second paragraph. What's the second paragraph of the Hallel? It starts, B'tseis Yisrael mi Mitzrayim. In Israel's going out from Egypt. So isn't that the perfect paragraph to read to correspond to the last section of the verse, which is B'tseisi mi Mitzrayim, in my going out of Egypt? So what should I do at that point? What is that mapping out for me? It's now time, after I've told over the story, again, the logical progression is that now I should give thanks to God. And so, but which paragraph of thanks do I choose? Out of all the Psalms, you know, so many chapters of Tehillim, different parts of Hallel, I think that we're trying to get as close to our verse as possible, where it says, B'tseisi mi Mitzrayim, when I was taken out of Egypt. So we choose the paragraph that says, B'tseis Yisrael mi Mitzrayim, when the Jewish people were brought out of Egypt. And that brings us to the end of Magid. We recite that paragraph, and then we say the final blessing, and we drink the second cup of wine, And that brings us to the end of Hallel. So this to me is just an amazing insight, amazing discovery. I don't think it was ever, written before, I don't know, the 1800s, the 19th century. And but once you hear it and once you see it, it's like it's right there. It's so clear that that's what's going on here. What starts off as just a jumble of random paragraphs that seem to have no order, we actually realize now have a beautiful order. They're mapped according to the verse, and actually they also follow a logical progression. It starts off, V'higadata levincha, you should tell your son, you should tell your children, and it's telling us we have to start by establishing the obligation. The obligation is to tell over the story. Why is there an obligation? Because we were slaves. Who is there an obligation on? Everyone. Who are we supposed to, what is the ultimate purpose? It's to tell it to the next generation. Levincha, to your children. That's the ultimate purpose. Everybody should do it, even if somebody's alone, they should do it. But ultimately, the goal of it is to be able to pass it on to the next generation. When do we do it? You might think we do it from Rosh Chodesh. No, it's Bayomahu. It's on that day, the day that we eat the matzah and the maror, the night of the Seder. What do? Lamor, we say over the whole story. After we've told over the story, we identify the various things that are at the Seder and what their purpose is. Ba'avur zeh. Part of the saying over is, this is because the Pesach offering is because of this, the matzah is because of this, the maror is because of this. And after we've told over the story, so now we can hopefully feel like we were there. And we can say, Asa Hashem li, God did this for me. In every generation, we have to see ourselves as if we were brought out of Egypt. We say, God did this for me. I have benefited from being brought out of Egypt. And then after we've told over the whole story and we've been elevated to the sense and the feeling that, and we see ourselves as if we ourselves left Egypt. So then all we're left with is to just give thanks and praise to God for that redemption. And that's to say, when I left Egypt, when I was brought out of Egypt, so at that point, we recite the paragraphs of Hallel, the first two paragraphs leading into the second paragraph, which begins, B'tseis Yisrael miMitzrayim, when the Jewish people went out of Egypt, where we thank God for the Exodus, using actually a chapter from Psalms, from Tehillim, that expresses thanks of God for that. And then we arrive at the end of Magid, we say the final blessing, and we make the blessing, we drink the second cup of wine. So there is the amazing discovery, amazing insight from the Malbim Haggadah. Again, not necessarily written by the Malbim, not clear who wrote it, but possibly by his student, Rabbi Naftali Maskil Le'eson. But a beautiful idea that just shows us how much there is beneath the surface that we don't even realize. And there's a very intentional order to the Haggadah, and the whole Haggadah, but we focused on Magid today. And to me, it's just very, very inspiring that to discover sort of such order and wisdom in any part of Torah, and this time in the Haggadah. Okay, thank you very much. We'll stop there.